Hi, I'm Niklas Carlsson. I'm at Linköping University. This is joint work that I've done with Derek Eager at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm going to talk about cross-user similarities and viewing behavior of 360 videos and some caching implications. Before I start, I wanted to give you a little bit of a side story. So this is me, 20 years younger, and very happy because it's the first time that I visit the Stanley Cup, the greatest trophy in sport and in ice hockey. Given that I'm a hockey player myself in the context of 360-degree experiences, it's perhaps not surprising that I would like to be able to watch a hockey game from the comfort of my own sofa, perhaps seeing my favorite team win the Stanley Cup, while get the feeling that I'm actually on the player bench myself. 360-degree video and virtual reality more generally put the user in control over their experience and has the potential to revolutionize our user experiences. However, it's highly bandwidth intensive, and because of that, it's important to identify and understand bandwidth saving opportunities. Much of the research that have tried to identify such bandwidth saving opportunities have leveraged that the user only has a limited visible area that it's viewing. This is called the viewport. Typically these works prefetch a high quality in the direction of the viewport and a lower quality in other directions. And then the hope is that you don't move your head that much, so you still get a good overall quality. When designing such protocols, it's important to take into account two types of uncertainties. First, the viewing directions, as illustrated here by a heat map of a user and how far that user is moving its head, and by the bandwidth variability, as illustrated here by a bandwidth trace. So you need to take this into account when prefetching different qualities, so to avoid stalls. So one way of doing that is with the help of dash and tiling. With HTTP adaptive streaming, the video is first split into chunks. Then each chunk is further split into different bit rates. And clients adapt the quality based on current buffer and network conditions. For example, a client might start at the low quality and then increase the quality based on the network conditions that it observes. In the context of 360, we might have something along these lines. So here I'm thinking of a user seen from the top, looking in the direction of the arrow. The circles represent different quality encodings, and we can see from the red that we have higher quality encoding in the viewing directions and lower in the other directions. Also in this context, we can adapt the quality based on current network conditions. We might start at a low quality and then increase the quality as we see we have bandwidth. And then we also need to account for users moving their head. So as the user moves their head, we adapt the direction in which we get the highest quality. So what we do in this particular work is that we provide a trace-driven analysis of the caching opportunities in this context. In particular, we present the first characterization of the similarities in the viewing direction of users watching the same 360 video, the overlap in viewports of these users, both instantaneously and on a per chunk basis, and finally, the potential cache hit rates for different video categories and network conditions. Our results provide insights into the conditions under which overlaps might be considerable and cache if effective. They can also provide information about how to best create tailored policies for caching of 360 video. We next describe the traces that we used. These were collected in a previous study that we did, where we used Oculus Rift combined with having users watch 360-degree YouTube videos. The videos were split into 5 categories. We're going to focus on 4 of these. So the rides category essentially provide you videos with a virtual ride. So here we see a heat map of such users. So we see that most of the focus is forward. So there might be things happening on the side, but typically you follow along with the ride. With exploration here, you might be on top of a skyscraper or something. You look in all directions. We see there's no particular focus. With static focus, it's typically a stage or something similar that's the main focus of the users. And then we have a fourth category where it's a moving focus. It's often objects moving around and we try to follow those objects. We split our analysis into 3 parts. In the first part, we focus on the instantaneous similarities. So here we have user A in red, user B in blue, so they're viewports, and the area in gray is then the viewport overlap. So that's going to be the focus here. Now let's look at the CDF of the instantaneous pairwise overlap for the different video categories. Here we can see much smaller pairwise overlaps for the exploration category compared to the other categories. As seen to the right, we can see similarly large differences when looking at the average pairwise overlap over entire sessions. We then generalized the idea of viewport overlap from a particular user's overlap with all previous users that have gone through that cache, for example. The details of that is provided in a technical report. These figures sort of illustrate the basic idea, but I refer to the technical report for details. Let's now look at how this overlap changes over time for the explore and the static videos. Here we can see how the average overlap changes over time, as well as how it differs from the first user, the second user, the fourth user, the 8th users, and the 16th user. On the left, we see that the Explorer starts with pretty low overlap, but then increase quickly, whereas on the right, we see that static start with a high overlap, but then don't improve that much. The clear exception is the exploration phase of the static user, where we see much bigger variations. Now for the second part, we need to remember that chunks are typically between 2 to 5 seconds long. Now, if we think of the instantaneous viewport at time 0, so the beginning of a chunk, it might look something like this. Now, if we think of what happened over a chunk duration, we might imagine that the head movement follow this red line. So if I do this in a step-by-step way, we might have something like this. So what happened here? Well, one thing that happened was that the viewport moved around, and there was an outer box that sort of expanded around that. So that's this area. That's this area here that I'm gonna call the per chunk coverage. Let's now consider the per chunk coverage of user A and compare that with that of user B. The difference is now the per chunk coverage overlap. Of course, you also need to take into account wraparounds and similar effects that we describe in our technical report. Let's first consider this overlap relative to the size of the bounding box itself. Here we can see that the Explore category have much smaller pairwise overlap than the other categories. However, when we compare the overlap with the viewport, then we observe much higher variation for the Explore category compared to the others. This is mostly due to greater head movements during these videos. Finally, in the third part, we run simulations. Here we compare the hit rates of videos of different categories, as well as comparison between bytes and object hit rates, differences between different type of bandwidth traces, and the impact of the available average bandwidth. In general, we saw significant differences in the bandwidth usage. For example, if we compare the hit rates between different categories, or perhaps better, let us consider the cache miss rates. So this is in some sense proportional to the external bandwidth usage that we see. So here the green area in some sense correspond then to the bandwidth usage for the static, and the red area here correspond to the bandwidth usage for the Explorer. And finally, with the bandwidth usage difference between these two different categories shown here in red. We can now easily identify the increase in miss rates for a particular user, in this case user 4. So here we see the miss rate for the static. Here we see the increase in miss rates when we add explore, and the difference between those then we can calculate to roughly 80%. Let's next look at the bytes versus objects. In general, we observe higher byte hit rates than object hit rates. This suggests even greater bandwidth savings than the previous results. When we consider the impact of network traces, we observe the greatest hit rates under stable conditions. Finally, when considering the average bandwidth available to the clients, we observe the greatest hit rates in the low bandwidth and the high bandwidth scenarios, where most clients are likely to be viewing at roughly the same quality. Finally, our conclusions. We present the first trace-driven characterization of the caching opportunities, focusing primarily on differences between different categories of videos. We observe substantial differences between the different video categories. So, for example, when it comes to overlap in viewports, both on instantaneous as well as on a per chunk basis, as well as large differences in the potential cache hit rates for different video categories and network conditions. Finally, we note that some of the same things that improve QE without a cache also improved cache performance. So, for example, improved viewport prediction techniques used on the clients, or things that provide stable network conditions, for example, cap-based solutions on the network side, or client-side solutions that reduce the number of quality switches. Finally, thanks for listening, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.